Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us on our Protecting the Public Purse or Policing the Poor, South Africa's Digital Welfare Fraud webinar. I think while everyone else joins, I'll just give a brief introduction to the session, introduce the panelists, and then we will begin. So the reason we're here today is that there's been public concern about fraud in South Africa's social protection system, and this has grown sharply in recent years. And it's mainly following several reports in the media about various syndicates, and of course, the very major discovery by the two Stellenbosch students in 2024 of significant vulnerabilities in the SRD grant system that potentially opened up millions of 18 and 9-year-olds to identity fraud. And in the response to this increased or heightened concern by the public, the government has moved to introduce various new tools to its already existing fraud mitigation arsenal. And these are mainly new automated and algorithmic measures, which include like stricter surveillance of beneficiaries, biometrics, and large-scale verification. So from our previous work at the IEJ and actually our last webinar on social protection to the people who are here that we hosted, we presented findings on exclusions, mainly from the SRD grant, which most of these new algorithmic measures are adopted from and actually being expanded to other longer standing grants. So we know from that research that these measures often ended up wrongly excluding many from accessing social protection, and that these exclusions weren't random, but instead affected the most vulnerable. So those with lower digital literacy, those who are financially excluded, those who are caregivers. So this latest research that we'll be talking about today that the IEJ has conducted explores the fraud in the social protection system. So we wanted to know what the overall scale of social grants fraud was, where and how the fraud is being perpetrated, who is perpetrating the fraud, and what the government is doing to stop it. And of course, whether these new interventions are working or if they instead introduce some of the new risks into the system. So, without completely preempting the presentation that we'll be hearing, we found that the last 10 years, the majority of fraud was perpetrated by government officials, employees, contractors, while the fraud done by beneficiaries was at a much smaller, disproportionate scale. And so this output, the fact sheet that is being discussed today, argues that the resources dedicated to policing beneficiary fraud are hugely disproportionate to the problem. So to unpack these findings, Dr. Kelly Howson will be presenting this research from the IEJ side and the implications of it. Dr. Kelly is a senior researcher and project lead in social protection at the Institute for Economic Justice. We are also lucky enough to be joined by local and international experts in social protection, human rights, and public digital infrastructure. So to further help unpack these results and discuss the political economy, design and impacts of South Africa's welfare fraud crackdown. So we are joined by Dr. Caroline Kenne. Dr. Caroline.
It sounds like we've lost Sianda. Is that just on my end?
Yeah, you've lost him.
Okay. Perhaps what we can do is let Sianda introduce the panelists yourselves, Abby and Caroline, at the beginning of the panel discussion. And while he reconnects, I can begin with the presentation. Shall we proceed that way? Okay. I'm going to share my screen. So Sianda has given a bit of background to the analysis that we want to present today, and I'm calling it analysis rather than research because we haven't gone out and done primary data collection for this work. What we've done is interrogate public data sources, news reports, and anecdotal accounts from beneficiaries who have been impacted in order to get a sense of the scale of the problem of fraud in the social grant system and how the government's responses may be helping or introducing particular new risks and harms. And fraud is a very provocative concept in the South African context. We've had so many numerous instances of fraud and corruption scandals at the national level over the past number of years. And so fraud always evokes a very strong public reaction. And there are a lot of government resources now being dedicated to addressing the scourge of fraud and corruption within public institutions. But the way that has translated into the social protection system has often been to burden the most vulnerable with concerns and suspicions about fraud. So we want to really interrogate that in this webinar. But I just wanted to frame the problem by kind of demonstrating some of these public pronouncements that have been made recently by influential people, policymakers, about the scale of fraud in the grant system. So very recently, after the national budget statement, which happened 2 weeks ago, we heard from Treasury policymakers and the Director General saying that social grant fraud still haunts South Africa. We've had numerous media reports about the fraud crackdown in the social grant system and how much money it's saving the fiscus following the national budget. We've also had reports of thousands illegally benefiting from social grants. And we continue to hear that fraud is rife in the social grant system. Now, I think in order to interrogate this, we need to understand what is fraud, because there's a difference between unlawfully benefiting from a social grant and being a fraudster or being guilty of committing fraud. So fraud is used quite broadly to refer to ineligible people accessing social grants, but it's actually a specific legal term. And in order to constitute fraud within the legal definition in South Africa, there must be misrepresentation or deceit. You must knowingly misrepresent or be dishonest about your status in order to access a social grant in this case. It must be deliberate and purposeful. You must know you're doing it. There's an intention to use deceit and misrepresentation for your own personal gain, financial gain, or otherwise. And it must cause actual or potential harm or loss to a victim. So there must be a specific harm that has been caused as a result of that action. So we wanted to break down the different types of fraud that are occurring in the grant system, because often these are kind of conflated or not sufficiently defined in media reports and public discourse. So we identified 4 types of fraud in the grant system, and these are roughly in line with the way that the Social Security Agency, SASSA, breaks down the different types of fraud in their reporting as well. So the first type is the type that we may be most familiar with, or we may hear about most often, which is ineligible people accessing grants. So if you have income above the means test threshold, for instance, the Social Relief of Distress SRD grant means test threshold is 624 Rand. If you have monthly income above that level, and you misrepresent your eligibility knowingly, you may be considered to have fraudulently accessed that grant. But we need, again, to emphasize this point that it must be based on knowing purposeful misrepresentation. There are many, well, we can hypothesize that there are a number of people who may be accessing grants who haven't purposefully misrepresented themselves, but may in certain months have income above the eligibility or means test threshold. There are other more kind of stark or examples of when people might access social protection but be ineligible. For instance, accessing the child support grant, but you don't have a child, at receiving the older person's grant, but you're not in the age category. And we also hear often of this phenomenon of double dipping, one person receiving two grants at the same time unlawfully. Another type of fraud that happens in and around the social grant system in South Africa is committed by predatory third parties. So these may be scams that are perpetrated on grant beneficiaries that explicitly target grant beneficiaries because they are a vulnerable group. And we hear quite often of such scams. So recently, you may have seen in the news reports of uh, deductions being made from beneficiaries' grants without their consent or their knowledge for ostensibly for funeral cover policies or other insurance policies. There's also been a phenomenon recently of websites posing as the official SASSA website in order to collect and sell beneficiaries' data, such as ID numbers, as well as predatory lending practices. These may or may not fall within a legal definition of fraud. But there certainly have been some cases in the past where unlawful predatory lending has taken place. So this is an example of one of the many websites that poses as SASSA in order to collect beneficiary data. And I think in a recent report, SASSA indicated that there were approximately 150 such websites. These websites encourage beneficiaries to check their grant status. Have they been approved in a particular month? And all they're doing is cross-referencing with the publicly available portal that SASSA operates. But they are in the process collecting the ID numbers and mobile numbers of beneficiaries, which can be sold on to third parties, to advertisers, or used for even more nefarious identity theft purposes. And I hope Abby will forgive me. I've used an open secrets graphic here, but I'm sure that most people in the room will be familiar with the Net1 and CPS scandal that was uncovered, whereby one of the official contractors within the government social protection system was using beneficiary data to target them for predatory financial products using social grants as collateral. A third type of fraud that occurs, and these categories are overlapping, but we found it useful to create this kind of typology just to better understand fraud in the social grant system. A third type of fraud that occurs is large-scale hacks, breaches of SASSA's digital systems, and these are often perpetrated by syndicates. Examples include breaking into the SASSA system in order to enroll multiple fake profiles of beneficiaries in order to receive funds, cyber breaches, and large-scale identity theft. And the most prominent example of this, as Sianda has already referred to, was the large-scale identity theft, or the use of the ID numbers of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of people who had recently turned 18, in order to register applications for the social relief of distress grant. Now, I just wanted to dive into this a little bit because there's a fair bit of kind of misunderstanding of this case. So what happened was that it was revealed by two University of Stellenbosch students that thousands of ID numbers of 18 and 19-year-olds had been used to apply for SRD grants before those people could apply for them themselves. Now, this was represented in the media and within parliamentary inquiries as a kind of sophisticated cyber breach, a sophisticated hack. But in fact, there wasn't any security breach of SARS's systems. It's relatively easy to randomly generate ID numbers for specific population groups. And so we believe that this is what happened, that those ID numbers were then used to apply for grants, but we don't actually know whether grants were paid out to those fake or stolen ID numbers, because that would have needed bank accounts and phone numbers also registered to the stolen ID numbers in the hands of the fraudsters. So we don't know if there was actual funds stolen as part of this fraud, and we don't, as far as we know, there have been no charges or prosecution. But of course, there were victims, those people who tried to apply for a grant and found that their ID numbers were already active in the system, and so they were prevented from accessing their entitlements. Then the final kind of fraud, category of fraud that we identify as that perpetrated by government insiders. These could be employees of SASA, employees of other institutions that are responsible for providing social grants, such as the post office. And this is where people who have access to those back-end systems may be diverting or appropriating funds meant for beneficiaries. So this can involve the duplication of beneficiaries' SASA cards and the withdrawal of funds from their account, the creation of fake, or as they're often called, ghost beneficiaries in the system, directing grants to ineligible friends or family members, as well as changing beneficiaries' bank accounts to their own bank accounts within the system so that payments are made to those fraudsters. So we looked into, and just to say, SASA reports every year on the number of fraud cases that are reported to law enforcement. And we looked into these reports, and SASA very helpfully breaks down those cases into these categories. So what we see in that historic reporting up until 2025 is that the vast majority, about 75% of fraud cases that are reported to law enforcement, were perpetrated by government insiders, contractors, and employees. So that's the red that you see in the figure here. Then a minority were perpetrated by individual beneficiaries, individual grant recipients, about 590 across the 11 years. That works out to roughly, if you average it out, 54 per year. And I just want to highlight that that's 54 out of a total population who is receiving a social grant of approximately 28 million. And then there is a minority of frauds perpetrated by moneylenders and other categories of people. So 54 frauds per year by beneficiaries out of a total of 28 million beneficiaries, and 2,658 frauds across the 11 years perpetrated by government insiders out of the total number of SASA employees at the moment stands at 7,817, although we should point out that government insiders may not only be SASA employees, as I mentioned, also post office employees and others. Now, I want to add a caveat here, which is that the government, DSD and SASA may say, well, we weren't uncovering beneficiary fraud previously, historically, because we weren't searching for it. And now we have systems in place where we are systematically rooting out fraud that's perpetrated by beneficiaries. But really what this highlights, this finding for us, is that there hasn't been a problem identified. And we should say that reviews have been conducted of grant beneficiaries. SASA has had measures in place to monitor and uncover beneficiary fraud over this time. The numbers don't justify the intensification of the policing of grant beneficiaries at the scale that we are seeing. And I'm going to now get into what new measures have been added, what methods have been intensified to root out and crack down on beneficiary fraud, and how those are working, what impacts they're having. So the first thing that I wanted to highlight here is that the drive to crack down on social grant fraud has really come from the National Treasury in particular. In 2025, during the budget allocation, a kind of unprecedented development took place, which was that National Treasury made SASA's operating budget conditional on a number of things. And these conditions are really kind of dictating the minutiae of how DSD and SASA must implement social development policy. So the National Treasury said to SASA, in order to access your operating budget, in order for SASA staff to have their salaries paid, they must implement the following measures: blanket bank checks on the bank accounts of all social grant applicants and recipients at least twice a year. Regular monitoring of data related to all social grant applicants and recipients across all of government databases. So this includes the Department of Home Affairs, income tax databases, UIF, the Contributory Social Protection Fund. And this is in an effort to uncover whether beneficiaries may have income above the means test threshold that was not disclosed to the agency. Biometric checks on all grant applicants and recipients. So that's checks either on facial biometrics or fingerprint biometrics to make sure that people are who they say they are, against databases both held by SASA and DSD, as well as the official National Population Registry that's held within the Department of Home Affairs. And crucially, SASA must submit quarterly reports to the National Treasury on the above, including on the number of reviews conducted, the number of grants suspended and cancelled, and the RAND savings achieved from grant cancellations. And I think that what's really important to acknowledge here is that this requirement to report on the RAND savings achieved really points to the fact that what this is a cost-saving exercise. The motive and the impetus here is to save the fiscus money. At the same time that the National Treasury is requiring all of these additional measures, all of these additional checks that SASA needs to perform, it's cutting SASA's operating budget in real terms. So in the medium term framework from 2026 over the next 3 years, SASA's operating budget will fall by 3.4% in real terms. So there are additional requirements for implementation and oversight that SASA is being required to fulfill on pain of having their operating budget withheld by the National Treasury at the same time as that operating budget is being further reduced. So we're seeing significant capacity constraints coming through in SARS's ability to fairly and rigorously conduct these fraud monitoring measures. So what are the actual measures? Just to go into a little bit more detail. The bank account monitoring. SARSA is going to check your bank account in partnership with all the major banks. So there have been agreements signed with all the major banks, and this entails a cost. I think that each bank verification check costs something like 40 cents, if I'm remembering rightly. And there are agreements governing this with all the major banks, which have not been made public. And Abby can maybe or maybe not talk more about that. But they're looking at whether any inflows are coming into your bank account over and above the means test threshold. It doesn't matter the nature or the purpose of those inflows. Is it money that you're holding on behalf of someone else? For example, child maintenance payments. Is it money that comes from a loan that you are required to pay back? Is it an ad hoc donation or a gift? Another aspect of this automated surveillance of all applicants and beneficiaries is the biometric surveillance. So they will match your biometrics with data held within the Department of Home Affairs, or if they don't have your biometrics, when you come to apply for a loan, for a grant, when you come to conduct your grant administration, they will be collecting those biometrics, that biometric data. Then there's the credit bureau data sharing. And this is another condition that is being required, has been added to the list of conditions that SARSA must conduct checks on the credit records of all grant applicants and beneficiaries. So this is being facilitated by the major credit bureaus. And what they're looking for is, did you ever declare an income when you applied for a loan or when you applied for financing for a major purchase? If you went to your bank and you applied for a personal loan and you said, I have an income of XYZ in order to be eligible for that loan, they're going to pick that up and it may indicate that you are actually not eligible for the grant you've applied for, or the grant that you're receiving. Then there's the database surveillance. So as I mentioned, they're checking against UIF, SARS, correctional services, government payroll, and all of this is in an attempt to find out if people have income that they haven't disclosed when they've applied for a grant. All of this forms part of a broader, increasingly algorithmic fraud detection system where all of these data sources are coming together and they are being kind of fed into an automated system which is flagging this person might be at risk of being a fraudster. This grant application may be fraudulent based on a whole range of data sources that can get kind of mixed together within an increasingly opaque system of algorithmic decision making. And I just want to highlight that despite the fact that historically we've seen fraud being perpetrated much more by government insiders and officials than by actual grant recipients and beneficiaries, these fraud response measures primarily target grant recipients. So in response to public concern about the need to safeguard public finances and the extent of fraud that occurs in South Africa, the suspicion is essentially being piled onto vulnerable grant recipients. Excuse me. And I just want to give an overview of some concerns with with the design of these fraud detection measures and how they can result in harm to vulnerable people and the exclusion of vulnerable people. So, with respect to the government databases, these are known to be out of date. They're not updated frequently enough to serve the purpose of actually identifying whether a person is not eligible for a grant. Or what we hear often from beneficiaries who have been excluded on the basis of checks against government databases is that SASA said that I'm receiving UAF, or SASA said that I'm on the government payroll, but I used to receive UAF. I used to be employed by the government, but I haven't for the past 3 months. And that's why I've applied for a social grant. And this is a very, very common situation. So there's an issue there with data quality. There's also an issue with accuracy. I mentioned that these bank verification checks, the checks on your bank accounts, can't differentiate between different types of inflows into bank accounts. This is actually a really significant and systemic driver of erroneous or unfair exclusion from the social relief of distress grant system in particular. And this was first developed in relation to the social relief of distress grant and is now being rolled out across the wider grant system to the child support grant, the older persons grant, the disability grant. So with respect to the SRD grant, some research that we conducted last year found that in cases where your application has been rejected on the basis of what they found in your bank account, the bank verification system, that 54% of those exclusions were erroneous, of people who actually were eligible, who actually did qualify for the grant. And it's very important to point out that these erroneous exclusions are more likely to exclude women because women in South Africa are more likely to share a bank account. They're more likely to receive child maintenance payments on behalf of children in their care and be excluded on that basis. They're more likely to receive remittances, again, on behalf of people in their care, and be excluded on that basis. In terms of the credit bureau checks I've already outlined, we don't know how far back the credit bureau data goes that's being accessed by SASA. You may be excluded because you applied for a loan a year ago, you applied for a loan 2 years ago, but since then your circumstances have changed. And indeed, it's because people's circumstances change that they find themselves in need of social assistance. So there's a question about the time scale of this data that's being used to flag people as potentially fraudulent applicants. There's also a privacy issue. When you apply for a social grant, you're essentially required to waive all of your POPIA rights, and to consent to your data being shared with any third party that the government deems necessary to assess your eligibility, or for SASA to access your data held by any public or private institution that they deem necessary for assessing your eligibility. There's an accountability question, and I'm hoping that Caroline can speak more to this because this is very much where her work has focused. But when digital and automated systems are used, what we often call black box algorithms are used to make decisions about people's rights. The accountability for those decisions is limited because we don't know exactly what data and what protocols have been used to generate those decisions. Particularly for SRD grant applicants, it's very difficult, nearly impossible, to contest the outcomes of automated decision making, especially on the basis of this bank account verification, because the design of the system precludes those kinds of appeals. And there's a risk of deepened exclusion. Where people are already marginalized, where they're already vulnerable to existing intersecting forms of social exclusion, they're more at risk of erroneous exclusion from the grant based on these based on these systems. So people without access to digital identification, smart IDs, are at a higher risk of exclusion by biometric verification. Women, caregivers, and rural communities are all at greater risk for some of the reasons that I've explained. Every additional bureaucratic hurdle that's put in the way of a vulnerable person accessing their entitlements is going to increase the incidence of erroneous exclusion, and that erroneous exclusion will be visited most on the most vulnerable because they lack the resources to overcome those additional digital hurdles, whether it's transport to get to the SASA offices, whether it's access to the kind of documentation required to prove that you are a legitimate and eligible beneficiary. So once you have been flagged by these algorithmic monitoring systems, these fraud detection systems, once they have identified you as somebody who may be fraudulently or incorrectly accessing a grant, you will be asked to come into a SASA office to complete a grant review in person. And this is what National Treasury is requiring of SASA through this budget conditionality. You'll receive an SMS telling you that you have 30 days to conduct your grant review in person. If you do not conduct your grant review in person within that time frame, your grant will be cancelled. Basically, you will be assumed to be incorrectly benefiting from a social grant, assumed even to be a fraudster. But there are significant barriers to completing grant reviews. Just receiving the SMS from SASA can be a barrier for particularly those with very little resources. Phones get lost or stolen, contact details are changed. People don't have digital access to internet connectivity and digital platforms. Then if you do receive the SMS, you have to pay for transport to SASA offices. That is a significant hurdle for the most vulnerable. Then you need to contend with long queues at SASA offices. And this has been exacerbated by the fact that the resourcing for SASA continues to be cut. So there are not enough staff. There is not enough physical infrastructure to be able to process the volume of reviews that need to be conducted. And so people have to stand in queues for hours. They have to come back multiple times and pay for transport yet again. You might stand in a queue all day not to be served and then have to come back another day. And it's very important to stress that the people who are being required to come in to demonstrate their eligibility as part of this review process are caregivers of children, older persons, and disabled persons, because those are the people that are receiving the social grants. And we've included some quotes in our fact sheet, which I won't read out in detail now, but these are quotes from media reports, where reporters have gone to the SASA offices and spoken to people standing in queues, and people have been giving their experience of how difficult it really is to conduct a grant review after you've received an SMS asking you to do so. So SASA is reporting quarterly now in line with the National Treasury's requirements on the grant review process and how many grant reviews are being conducted and how many grants are being cancelled. So you can see the blue line here. That is the number of review notices that have been issued. The red line right at the bottom there, that's the number of grants that have been cancelled after having review notices issued based on confirmed ineligibility. So we've reviewed you, we found through our data, through our monitoring, that you may not actually be eligible for the grant you're receiving. You've come in to conduct your review. SASA has confirmed you are in fact not eligible and your grant has been cancelled. So that's really a minority. The yellow line is the people who haven't been able to conduct their review within the time frame stipulated, within the 30 days. And that that constitutes a significant majority of the grants that have been cancelled as a result of this review process. So just to dig down a little bit more into this ineligibility versus cancellation question, because what we're hearing at the national scale from SASA officials, from Treasury officials, is that we have cancelled 70,000 social grants that we've found to be fraudulent or incorrect. But the majority of grants that have been cancelled because they weren't able to complete the review in time. And then DSD SASA say, well, if you didn't pitch up, if you didn't come to the offices to demonstrate you're eligible, that probably means you weren't eligible. That probably means that you were indeed a fraudster. But that's not necessarily the case. We know that many, many people face these significant barriers to showing up to conduct reviews, and those people are most likely to be the most vulnerable. In addition, if you do show up, you do conduct your review, and SASA does say, okay, you have income above the means test threshold, you are ineligible, and we're going to cancel your grant. That doesn't necessarily mean that you are guilty of fraud, that you have committed fraud, because remember, fraud entails intentional misrepresentation. So there has not been any reporting from SASA as to the number of this segment of people who have been confirmed ineligible, who were in fact or are in fact guilty of fraud. But they have said publicly that if you don't pitch up for your review, or if we're right that you're no longer eligible, we can refer you to law enforcement because we can assume that you are guilty of fraud and we can pass you on to law enforcement. We don't know the extent to which this is happening yet. But this brings me to the recent budget, and I'll wrap up soon. I know that I'm nearly out of time. But during the budget speech earlier in February, we heard the Minister of Finance celebrating the savings that have been achieved from the social grant system as a result of these verification procedures. Enhanced targeting of social grants and authentication of beneficiaries to reduce fraud in the grant system will yield 3 billion rands of savings over the next 2 years. We've identified X number of grants as incorrect or fraudulent and therefore terminated them. For us, this point about 3 billion in savings raised a question mark, because what we know from SASA's reporting is that in the past financial year, 70,000 grants have been cancelled, and that has yielded savings of 44 million per month, or approximately 500 million a year. So if National Treasury is requiring SASA to save an additional, to save 2 billion from cancelling grants and rejecting grant applications over the next year and an additional 1 billion the following year, that would imply a quadrupling. They would need to quadruple their current rate of cancellations and rejections. This seems extremely unfeasible, given the fact that they've already used this blanket monitoring of beneficiary data to identify the most suspicious cases, and they've already processed those most suspicious cases. So this raises a concern that there's going to be additional pressure on SASA to meet this target of 3 billion in savings, which is not does not correlate to the current rate of grant cancellations, which, as we've shown, are already, not necessarily correlated to fraud itself. In the background to this, the broader context to this is that already we know that the need and eligibility for social grants within the broader community already outstrips the number of people who are actually receiving grants. So at the same time that National Treasury is pressurizing SASA to reduce the overall quantum of social grants that the state is providing, there are more people in need of social grants. So we can illustrate that in relation to the child support grant. Previously, 7 or 8 years ago, the number of people receiving a child support grant was slightly higher than the number of children in poverty. That has now inverted. There are more children in poverty than children receiving a child support grant. So this is the backdrop for this accelerated, intensified cancellation of grants. We're going to see more and more children in poverty at the upper bound poverty line who are not receiving child support grants. And this is my concluding slide. Um, so what are the takeaways from all of this? These are the points that I really want to emphasize. The fraud crackdown is being driven by National Treasury via this kind of backdoor policy-making lever, which is conditionality on SASA's operating budget. If you do not do this, we're going to take away the money for your salaries, basically, as well as these inflated savings targets. At the same time that Treasury is requiring SASA to significantly scale up these reviews, they're cutting SASA's operating budget, and this is leading to queues, and it's exacerbating the problem of people not being able to conduct their grant reviews. Then, when people aren't able to conduct their grant reviews, they are assumed to be ineligible, and their grants are cancelled. And this is where these statistics are coming through, 70,000 grants cancelled. National Treasury then takes those numbers and on the national stage delivering the national budget says 70,000 people were found to be guilty of fraud. But this doesn't square with the historical data. The vast majority of uncovered fraud cases over the past 11 years have been perpetrated by government officials and contractors, not deliberate misrepresentation by individual beneficiaries. But of course, the focus of the fraud crackdown is policing beneficiaries who are caregivers of children, predominantly women, seniors, and persons with disabilities. And that's why our fact sheet that we're reporting on today is possibly provocatively titled "Going After the Gogos," which, for those not in South Africa, Gogos refers to older women, grandmothers. Digital and algorithmic systems are being rolled out at pace to detect fraud and ineligibility, but there are serious concerns with the accuracy, the data quality, and the lack of accountability of these systems. Then, once you're flagged by these systems as needing to come in and conduct a review, the most vulnerable face the highest barriers to conducting these reviews. And this is against the kind of backdrop of SASA's lack of capacity to enable this. And these barriers include digital exclusion, disability, transport cost, documentation requirements, and long queues at SASA offices. The vast majority of cancellations are not due to confirmed ineligibility or fraud, but due to failure to conduct a review. This system overall entails serious risks to rights and inclusion, but it is justified on the basis of alarmist and unevidenced narratives of widespread fraud occurring in the social grant system. And just to finish off, our concern now is that these fraud detection measures and reviews will intensify significantly in order to meet National Treasury's saving targets. I will end there, and I look forward to a stimulating discussion with our panelists and to answering audience questions.
Thank you, Kelly. Apologies everyone for the cutoff during the introduction. I got an unexpected power cut and I was cut off just as I was introducing our panelists. So I think I will do that, just briefly introduce each speaker and then let them offer their reflections on the presentations that we've just heard. So our first panelist is Dr. Caroline Kene. Dr. Caroline is a research fellow and lead of the Digital and Technology Cluster at the Institute of Development Studies in the UK. Her background is in information systems with a specialization in digital development and civic tech. She has led two civic tech projects, a MobiSAM and Mobi SAF8 at local government level in Southern Africa, providing a platform for citizens to report on service delivery issues. Her research interests include program evaluation, strategy formulation, user research, and user experience design. And she has over 15 years of experience working in digital development and collaborating across government, academia, industry, and civil society. And she kindly leads the DISPACT project on civic voice in the digitization of social protection in South Africa. So I'm going to invite Dr. Caroline to just briefly offer her reflections on the presentations we've heard so far. And then the way that it's going to work, just briefly, as I was going to do house rules, was just before I was cut off, is just that we're going to now allow the panelists to come up and just offer their reflections, hopefully 5 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes for those reflections. And then we'll open it up for discussion, allowing questions from the audience, also have our questions that will be directed at the panelists. So if you have any questions at this point, and I see that Linda has already posted a question on the chat, so I ask that everyone do that either directly on the chat or use the Q&A feature. And then we'll get to those when we open up for the discussion after the reflection. So without taking any more time, I'd like to invite Dr. Caroline for her reflection on the presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Sianda, and thank you, Kelly. That was a very interesting presentation, very informative. And I would also like to say that it aligns very much with our research. Our study was a collaboration with Black Sash and Rhodes University and Varsity College in South Africa. And our main objective was to understand accountability in digitalized social protection systems, specifically focusing on social grants. And our study was very much primary data collection, support from Black Sash. And a lot of these findings align very much with what we have discovered. I think our main aspect is accountability displacement, where obviously traditionally we expect that government is accountable to citizens, but now with these specific mechanisms of fraud detection or fraud first kind of campaign from government, it's sort of like reversed the whole aspect of accountability, hence accountability displacement. So I don't think I want to go too much into it because there are some really good questions that Sianda engaged me on that I'll probably save for discussion and just give Abby a chance to reflect on the presentation.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Caroline. Yes, we'll get into those questions at the end of these reflections. So on our panel, we also have Abby May. Abby is an investigator at Open Secrets and has contributed to every thematic area in the organization. She holds an MPhil in Justice and Transformation from the University of Cape Town, where her research centered on societal transitions, artificial intelligence, and politics. She has been the project lead on Open Secrets' digital profiteers investigations that focused on exposing the privatization and exploitation of the South African welfare system by private tech companies. And I'll now invite Abby to offer up her reflections on the presentation we've just heard. Thank you.
Thank you, Sianda, and thank you, Kelly. I mean, this research was like incredibly insightful, and I think also very necessary right now. I have a couple of reflections from the presentation. I think the first is this narrative of the National Treasury crackdown on fraud, right? I think it's very interesting for me that National Treasury has placed these like very like stringent conditions on the DSD and SASSA on how they kind of make sure that the budget that is allocated to social assistance is used effectively and actually goes to social grant recipients. And they've kind of utilized this narrative of, you know, there is a lot of fraud in the system. And that is a fact. There is an enormous amount of fraud within the social grant system. The problem is that most of the people impacted most severely by that fraud are grant recipients themselves. I mean, like the fact sheet like indicates, you know, many grant beneficiaries have been the victims of harm, of identity theft, of government employees relaying misinformation on how to go about your application or review processes for your social grants. And I mean, this issue of government employees being implicated in fraud within the grant system is, I mean, it predates even 2014. On the slide that shows that the research that the government is kind of conducting on keeping track of that kind of fraud in the system. I mean, it predates 2014. I think in 2007, the SIU and DSD were conducting like joint investigations into government employees that were essentially getting social grants even though they had salaries as well. And so that's just me trying to say that, you know, these government institutions aren't wrong. There is fraud and there does need to be a crackdown. The problem is how they're implementing this crackdown is definitely focusing on the wrong targets, in my opinion, which we'll get to in the discussion later on. And then I think the only other reflection I wanna highlight is this algorithmic fraud detection system that Kelly so usefully like outlined. It's not, from the research we have found in previous investigations and investigations that we're currently conducting at Open Secrets on this issue, this fraud detection system isn't one thing. So there's many different kinds of third-party companies that are being contracted by the government to assist it in conducting basically this algorithmic fraud detection on social grants applications and payments. And what that means is that there is a variety of different kinds of technological tools being applied in this fraud detection system that we are unsure if the government knows how to actually monitor. Like, I don't think there's public information on that, or if there is, I haven't been able to see it. But I think that's also really important to highlight, that it's not just this one thing, but there's like plenty of different kinds of actors in that fraud detection system that, for what we know currently, we're unsure about how well they are being monitored in that system. So that's all I'll say on my reflections. Thank you, Sianda.
Thank you, Abby. And I think now we'll move to the discussion part of the program. So I sent some questions to the panelists that I had to drive the discussion forward, but I see also that there are questions in the chat. So without necessarily privileging myself, the way we're going to do it is I'm going to just rotate the questions that we have. And I think a lot of them will probably be directed at you, Kelly. And I didn't send questions to you, so it works. It'll just be, I'll open the, well, I guess I'll read some of the questions that haven't yet been answered in the chat, and then I'll also pose my questions to Abby and Caroline. And then also just to say, for participants and attendees, is that if you do have any questions, of course, you can pop them in the chat. You're also welcome in any of the open space that we'll have to raise your hand, and I'll acknowledge that and allow you to speak if you do have any questions. So I think to start off in the discussion section. I think, Kelly, there's some open questions there for you. I'll read one from Moses, if you can please respond to that, which is that what has been the response and consequences in terms of government officials being implicated? Are they being blacklisted in terms of government employment? Are these officials doing it in their individual capacity or part of a larger group in terms of fraud and social welfare? And I'll also add Londeka's question, but are they really fraudsters? Because okay, I think that is already a discussion happening in the chat, which I will not encourage everyone to contribute there. But yes, Kelly, I think if you could start us off just responding to that and any other open questions you might still want to respond to in the chats. Thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Yanda, and thanks everybody who has added questions in the chat. So in terms of what is happening, what has been the response and consequences for government officials who have been implicated in fraud, just to note that that data that we referred to of the frauds that have been perpetrated between 2014 and 2025, that is limited to frauds that have been reported to law enforcement. So there is already consequences by virtue of those appearing in the data. So we are seeing prosecutions, charges being brought, and prosecutions of government employees who have been implicated in social grant fraud. And there have been a number of high-profile cases just in the last year or so. There were a series of arrests that happened at a SASA office in Gauteng. So there are consequences coming through, and there have been efforts to kind of identify where these frauds are being perpetrated by government officials. A lot of that has been on the basis of whistleblower reports, as I understand. So there have been kind of maybe colleagues blowing the whistle where employees are perpetrating frauds. And then I just wanted to speak to the discussion that's been happening in the chat, to Linda's question, which I think is a very important one. We can't draw too much conclusions from this historical data about who's perpetrating fraud, because these verification measures or these attempts to identify beneficiary fraud have only now been introduced. So surely we're going to see the identification of beneficiary fraud on a much greater scale going forward. And it is a limitation. And it's true that we can't draw, we're limited in the conclusions that we can draw from this historical data before the fraud detection measures have been rolled out on such a large scale. But what we can say from this historical data is that the efforts to significantly intensify the monitoring and policing of beneficiaries aren't necessarily justified by what we know already about the scale of beneficiary fraud in the system. And I think it's important also to highlight that there have been measures, long-standing measures, to verify or to identify fraud perpetrated by beneficiaries. So grant reviews are something that have happened for a very long time. They're something that exist in the social assistance regulations, but they are more targeted, or more they're undertaken or have been undertaken on a smaller scale. Usually they're based on random audits, as opposed to the proactive monitoring of all beneficiaries and applicants. So that's the difference. It's not that there haven't been measures to identify fraud in the past. So we may see, beneficiary fraud being identified on a greater scale going forward. But as I have tried to outline in the presentation, these measures to identify fraud are fundamentally flawed, and they are leading to the cancellation of grants on a large scale where fraud hasn't actually been proven.
Okay. Thank you, Kelly. I'll now ask first question to Dr. Caroline. So you've written about accountability displacement, which is the idea that when a digital system fails citizens, they often cannot discern the reason for that. So is it the reason that they are excluded or they've been failed due to a technical glitch of flawed procedure or discriminatory design choices? So this is clearly in play in the fraud detection system and this grant reviews that Kelly has presented on, because the way that it works is once they've been flagged, they don't actually receive any information about what it is that got them there. And because they're using multiple sources, they don't actually know what it is. So I wanted to ask if you could briefly expand on how this harms rights, and furthermore, if accountability displacement is in any way mitigated when beneficiaries of older standing grants, who, unlike, say, the SRD grant in South Africa, where once they've been flagged as ineligible, lose their grants immediately, is that somehow mitigated by them being allowed to sit with an official in order to conduct a review?
Thank you for that. I actually want to build on what Kelly was talking about earlier around fraud detection of beneficiaries and how it's been a main focus of government. But at the same time, she presented that pie chart where most of the fraudulent activity sits with government officials. And one problem that's obviously augmented by this is because citizens cannot just kind of distinguish like how did they get actually the outcome of practicing fraudulent activity, for instance. They cannot distinguish whether it's a system error, an eligibility decision, or some sort of administrative failure. And therefore, citizens are kind of sitting with having to prove that they are the ones not fraudulent rather than the other way around, because there's no clear mechanism or accountability mechanism to kind of exercise their rights and hold government accountable for practicing fraud. And in our research, we had several accounts from our grant recipients actually talking about these very issues. There's no particular clear mechanism in which they can hold government accountable. And now, if we talk about the other grants besides the SRD, where your beneficiaries will have access to report on these particular issues they're experiencing. But what was commonly reported by beneficiaries was that the officials themselves do not know how to even locate the problem or the fraudulent activity. Where is it coming from? How can you actually explain it in relation to the algorithmic decisions being made? How can you override them? And sometimes systems fail and they cannot even locate who to address the problem with. And so, if it's the case with older standing grants, the say, and imagine how it is now with SRD grants, where the whole process is digitalized, you just add into an existing systemic structural problem of exclusion. So that's my response to that question.
Thank you, Dr. Caroline, for that response. Very good response. To Abby, I wanted to ask, so through your work, you have documented how companies like Net1 and CPS, which I think Kelly also touched on, have used their privileged access to beneficiary data in the past to target recipients of financial products they did not consent to. So this was a huge scandal, but there are also other smaller examples. So why do you think this kind of corporate predation gets so much less political attention than a pensioner who may have been flagged for, say, an outdated credit bureau record?
Thanks, Yanda. Before I answer that, I actually want to just comment on Caroline's last point on the research that they found about government officials being unable to actually, respond to assessments in an adequate manner. And from the research we found, we've always been concerned about the fact that the state, when it comes to social grants administration, has consistently outsourced the building of the infrastructure required for administering applications, administering reviews, administering payments. And a consequence of that is that much of the actual knowledge required on how to respond effectively to social grants recipients does no longer it's no longer held with the state, it's held with private companies who are building, that the infrastructure for this administration, which is a big risk, which is a really, really big risk. And it kind of ties back to your question, Siyanda, where the state does not have the capacity to build the technical infrastructure to actually do digitalized assessments and application processes and payments. They just don't have the capacity for that, primarily because of the post offices being closed down and issues with a state entity called the Post Bank that took over from the post offices. And because the state has consistently been unable to actually build its own infrastructure to do this, and it's decided to contract most of these skills and resources it requires to private companies. What happens is that these private companies now have access to millions of grant recipients and applicants' data. And we are unsure, Open Seekers is unsure of how effectively SASSA and DSD are actually monitoring that, because what Net1 and CPS did show is that CPS was a company that had complete access to all the information running throughout the grant system. And that included identity information of grant recipients, but most importantly, their financial information. And they were able to access, the financial transactions that were coming in and out of grant recipients' accounts, whether that was a bank account or through their card transactions at retailers. And in a way, what a company and a case study like CPS shows is that through having access of that kind of information, they're able to take that information and then monetize it, like Kelly was explaining earlier, through predatory marketing practices, which, to answer your question, Siyanda, isn't necessarily illegal. It's not like, it's not really unlawful for a private company to come to a social grant recipient and say, you need a funeral policy. They don't explain anything past that and potentially lie and say, I'm just using an example, potentially lie and say, this will help you with your SASSA reviews process. But then they link them up to a funeral policy, and then, deductions are being made from a grant recipient's account. That's not necessarily, like, in terms of South African law, there's a big, big gap in terms of that kind of fraud. And I think that's why the state hasn't necessarily been focusing on those kind of cases on the one end, but also because I think there's just not much interest from the state to focus on those kinds of cases. I mean, CPS has gone bankrupt, and their parent company, Net1, is rebranded into a company called Lesaka, and they haven't paid that unlawful contract. They haven't paid the monies back that they got from that unlawful contract years ago. They haven't paid that money back. And it doesn't seem like the state is really pushing efforts to recuperate those funds, which is like billions of rands, which could be another way for them to save, quote unquote, 3 billion rand in their fraud crackdown. So on the one end, to answer your question, Siyanda, I think there's not much political interest, but then on the other end, there's also this legal gap of that kind of fraud being able to actually be prosecuted. Yeah.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you for that response. I think I'll go back to the chat just to pick up on some open questions. Kelly, I think I'll batch these and then just ask that you give feedback in your response so that we have, And then also to the attendees, if they still any questions that you may have, to continue popping those in the chat, or you're also welcome to raise your hand at any point for your questions. The first is coming from Linda. I'm not sure if you by 20,000 people were 210,000 people were reported, especially in the media, we saw after the implementation of the conditions as having committed fraud. That's how it was reported. So if you would please just have some clarity there, or as to 210 people were flagged. And then another question from Spelele is, what would your proposed review system look like if you're not in favor of the current system being implemented by SASSA as per Treasury Directive? Because, of course, it is undeniable that there needs to be some kind of review to prevent people who shouldn't be accessing grants from accessing them.
Thanks, Yanda. We're having a bit of trouble hearing you. But I heard the questions, so I'll address those now. The 210,000 number, this was widely reported in the media because this was when SASSA had initiated these bank verification and credit. Actually, the 210,000 number came specifically from credit bureau checks. And I think that number has now increased to 400,000, and that's with the bank verification system coming online as well. And what SASSA did was to go out and kind of comment in the media and say, we've identified these cases as potentially fraudulent. But this is the kind of effect of what I tried to outline. The issues with bank and credit bureau checks, and how they're not necessarily, and in most cases, not at all, actually identifying fraud. These are being billed as fraudulent. It's what we're hearing from officials. But there are many fundamental problems of accuracy, of data quality, with these systems. So that's the first step in the fraud monitoring, is flagging profiles digitally and algorithmically. Then these 210,000, now 400,000 people are issued with review notices by SASSA and asked to come in to demonstrate their continued eligibility, essentially to disprove this vague allegation that they may be guilty of fraud. There's very little information given as to why they have been identified as potentially fraudulent. So they are now having to kind of contest an allegation, a vague allegation of fraud without much substantiation at all. And then a number of grants are cancelled. That's the 70,000 that have been cancelled following reviews. But the vast majority of those cancelled grants were people who weren't able to conduct reviews, not people who actually came in and managed to disprove these, people who actually came in for reviews and SASSA's allegations were proven to be correct. So we need to take these claims about 210,000 fraudsters, 400,000 with a huge grain of salt. These are allegations that are based on questionable methods, and the vast majority of which are unproven. To Sipalele's question of what would a better system look like? What I would say is we had a system previously that was functioning relatively well. It's been widely kind of agreed by researchers and policymakers that the long-standing grants, the child support grant, the older persons grant, historically were well targeted. They were reaching the people that they needed to be reaching. And there was a system of random audits, where like a small number of people each year would be asked to come to SASSA and furnish documents like bank statements and other documentation to demonstrate that they are still eligible. And this functioned as a disincentive for people to defraud the system. And that worked well. There's no evidence, very little evidence, as we've shown, that beneficiary fraud was occurring on a large scale. So what I would say is we should go back to the system that was functioning as intended. I've just received a message from Sianda that he's experiencing technical difficulties again. So maybe I can step into his role of moderating and address some of the other questions in the chat. Or actually, we had further questions for our panelists. Sianda is just reminding me of this. So a question to Abby, perhaps. Many new private actors have entered the grant delivery space, as you've already mentioned. So examples of this include grant payments at retailers, as well as income verification by banks and credit bureaus. And I know that Open Secrets has been doing a lot of work in this space. And these contracts, this private actor involvement is now being expanded to the longer standing grants from the SRD grant. So in your opinion, are the conditions in place for a repeat of the Net1 and CPS scandal? Have we learned from the Net1 and CPS scandal? Are there more safeguards in place now? And have things meaningfully improved since 2018? Or are we at risk of seeing another scandal of this type in the grant system? And once you've replied to that, I'll pose a question to Caroline, and then maybe we will have time for a few more audience.
Thanks, Kelly. So on the one hand, things have improved since Net1, in the sense that, okay, this is going to sound a bit strange, but I mean, the pandemic did introduce a new kind of grant. So it has also, on the one hand, things have improved in the sense of, I think there is a more robust political will from not just civil society, but also government itself to actually extend social assistance framework to a much broader category of the South African public, which I think is a great thing. However, I think we are currently at risk of a repeat of what we saw at Net1 and CPS. On the one hand, the Net1 and CPS case study was an issue of problems in the procurement process of that contract with CPS, right? So the procedure of how the contract was awarded to CPS was found unlawful. And that's basically how that case kind of panned out. And I think one of the risks right now that the state is kind of running, and that we might see more information coming out on in the next coming years, is whether the procurement processes of the private companies and third-party actors that are assisting the state in digitalizing the social grant system, if those procurement processes have actually been done well, if they've been done on time, and if the private actors that have been awarded those contracts were awarded the contracts fairly. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, under the Disaster Management Act, a lot of things had to happen very quickly for the SRD grant, right? And so there is still a little bit of an obscurity of whether the procurement processes for the companies that built, the digitalization of the SRD grant application system, whether that happened adequately. So there's a risk for that, right? And we might see similar risks come up with the procurement processes for the other grants as the government continues to kind of extend digitalization in that way. And then very much so deductions of grant recipients' grants because of third-party companies having undue access to their financial transaction data. And on the one end, government has come out and stated that, they're putting in place reviews of deductions on grant recipients' accounts, that they've contracted, I think it's a company called QLink or whatever, to assist SASSA with basically making sure that deductions aren't happening on grant recipients' accounts. The problem is, one of the biggest risks that came out of Net1 and CPS was this issue of informed consent. And this is something that in regulation is also very, very kind of blurry as well, where grant recipients, like you mentioned, Kelly, in your presentation, are kind of forced to provide blanket consent to these digital systems. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're being informed of what's being done with their data and who has access to it. And I think there's real risks that might come out of that as well. So my answer to you is yes. Yes, I think things have gotten a little bit more complex and a little bit more riskier, simply because there's more private companies in the chat now. It's not just Net1 and CPS. It is retailers, it is credit bureaus. We also don't know which credit bureaus have been contracted through tender procurement. We don't know, what those contracts say. And just a last point, Open Secrets is doing an investigation right now on the banks that are doing the income verification for DSD and SASSA. And so I can't speak too much about that in detail, but what I can say is that I don't think there is much understanding from the state side on how to ensure that grant beneficiaries' data is protected. And I think that's where the biggest issues of fraud is actually being sourced from. Thanks.
Thanks, Abby. I see Sianda has rejoined, but Sianda, you may not have been following the discussion up until this point. So I might just jump in and ask Caroline another question. I also note there have been another couple of questions in the chat. Thank you, Kath, for your comment and question. I hope we'll have time to address these. But Caroline, so I want to zoom in on this question of digital public infrastructure, the digitalization of the social protection system, because it's one of the government's main priorities at the moment. And the social protection system in particular is serving as the kind of testing ground for digital public infrastructure. And the largest project within this space is the My Mzansi platform. It's argued that this will improve efficiency and ultimately favor grant beneficiaries, for instance, by reducing queues at offices. But what do you see as the potential risks, if any, of social protection digitalization? And how do these weigh against the benefits of greater efficiency, faster payments, and shorter wait times?
Thank you for that. I think, because my field is information systems, so we're very practical about digitalization in relation to its benefits. So efficiency is there, but the question is efficiency for who and at what cost, and what are the implications of that? If I'm thinking of building on what Abby has already spoken about at length, around private actors and various other actors, retailers involved in the whole space, and how it's getting worse. It will actually become worse with the implementation of digital public infrastructure, the My Mzansi initiative, because the idea of that initiative is to have like a sort of centralized government. So at the moment, a lot of the databases are siloed. But if you have a very centralized approach to government, like digitalizing public services, then there's obviously more vulnerability and security issues. But at the same time, there's also the issue of oversight, or the ability of civil society to act on these changes that are happening. What's happening now is that digitalization is actually being developed in government at a way faster pace than social innovation, and how civil society and citizens can hold government accountable. So they're not really working in parallel. So we've heard at length the issues that are actually occurring, for beneficiaries, as well as for government officials who are also at a disadvantage, especially at local level. But we've not really asked ourselves enough about okay, so what do we do now? And I think, well, Abby has spoken about some really interesting approaches and mechanisms. And what we're trying to do is to sort of find out how do we work with existing accountability mechanisms and what else needs to be addressed in terms of how we co-design. Is it possible to co-design? Does civil society have the capacity to participate in these co-design approaches with government and the private sector? Are there particular policies on what the private sector can and cannot do? And the issue, even just to thinking of even informed consent with the data that comes from beneficiaries that's shared with other commercial actors. Do beneficiaries understand the implications of their decisions? And it is illegal. I believe it is illegal. I mean, Abby mentioned that, well, they are sort of allowed to do that, but actually it sort of goes against the POPIA Act, I believe, in relation to informed consent. But this has not been exercised with the excuse that it's too complex for them to understand. If it's complex, then there's definitely an accountability problem there.
Thank you, Caroline. I see that we have gotten to 2:30, which is when the webinar was scheduled to end, and there are still some outstanding questions in the chat, which I think we've noted, and I think we'll directly follow up with everyone who has asked their questions. They're very grateful for that. But yeah, we've come to the end of the webinar. I'd like to thank everyone for joining. Thank you everyone for engaging in the chat. I think it was a very lively discussion happening there and very good questions being asked. Thank you, of course, to our panelists, Dr. Caroline Kenne and Abby May. Really amazing insights, and thank you for reflecting on the presentation and giving us your time this afternoon. And of course, thank you very much to Kelly as well for a really great, insightful presentation. So next steps from here is we are going to follow up with everyone who participated, even those who did sign up. So we'll be sending, I think, the slides to you, as well as the recording of the webinar, and then also we'll be directly responding to some of the questions that were outstanding at the end of this meeting. But thank you everyone for joining, and have a good rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, everyone, and to Sianda for facilitating. Bye.